What gifts have been brought to me? Once again, this vampiric relic is in the proper hands of LordeStarfox and, of course, the Midnight Society. Warning, the following video has flashing lights and also includes content that may be deemed inappropriate for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Still warm, just the way I like it.
My creatures of the night, yes, welcome back to another episode of Midnight Lycanthropy here on LordeStarfox Radio. We do have Dr. Reed, one of the members of the Midnight Society team. Yes, she is one of the residential scientists here, is already sitting around the late night fire, getting ready to burn the midnight timber into the early hours of the morning with us. I do have a few contracts that have collected interest, and I do need to collect. Are you ready to take a walk into the madness tonight, Dr. Reed?
Absolutely. Star Fox, I am ready.
Excellent. Let's do this. To the audience, we are going to toss Dr. Reed the good old mic here, and she is going to fill up the good old cabinet upstairs with some brain power for us. And if you need me, let me know. I am just unmute away.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Kenny. You're amazing as always. And this platform, the messages and the content that are so vital and important to such a rare niche in the world. I actually wanted to gather tonight to discuss some additional observations and offerings to questions that I know stirred beneath within me and are probably also stirring beneath in other collective minds, asking to thin the veil between what is mystery, what is realism, and idealism for our own self and collective mastery. I know in the last episode, I dove in a little bit to some background history on our ranch, although I felt I didn't actually get too much emotional depth engaged because a part of myself was still disassociative to the experience. And I still am to the extent, to some degrees, like the ones that I want to discuss tonight. And that's only because for myself as a professional behaviorist and for someone who deals with nature day in and day out and trains animals essentially for a career and a passion, there are a lot of things that when you have a clearer level of understanding, you tend to cognitively disassociate at times from things that can trigger what should naturally be terror or fear or could essentially create trauma. But for myself, in my own personal experiences, the level of reality that I grew up with and experienced in the human construct of our own artificially created cultural transmission of Skinner boxes that are a hodgepodge of a mess often leave many of us traumatized. But then for those of us like myself who we branch away to understand things. And this has been a lifelong passion of mine. And you learn to associate differently when you move out into nature. And there's a different construct, and there's a different conditioning, there's a different mindset. And for myself, if I was already creating a buffer in those experiences, and that's come with adaptation essentially my whole life of having a culmination of bizarre experiences that I really haven't essentially talked about other than for those who are in my closest circle. So even discussing these things on a public platform has essentially been partially controversial for myself, but getting thrown into all of this essentially through divine guidance and synchronicity has prepositioned me to really contemplate what to bring forth through my own experiences and then also my own wisdom, because essentially this is a learning experiment for all of us who are involved in this. And there's also a lot of unknown factors that we are navigating. But I feel partially blessed and bestowed with the fact of my own upbringing and the setting and context that I was raised in. Although I never anticipated in a million years that this element and the Dogman phenomena um would arise. I again, from those very first experiences, I had just automatically linked them as potentially ET phenomena, um, just because of some of the obscurities. Now, the experience I talked about in the last episode was actually super intense for myself. Um, but the way I've handled every experience out here, because today is kind of just this strange day where Three Eye Atlas is in alignment with us. All these just almost sci-fi level of realities that it seems like unreal, but yet we're here. We're here at this threshold. Um, but for myself, I never anticipated all of these strings of events and then the sequence that led up to the position and where I am right now. In 2012 and prior to, it's obvious that there was already a pre-existence here. Although I hadn't put all the pieces together on that, I was just bracketing it into this alternative phenomenon and things I don't typically talk about. And I still am quite reserved naturally on a lot of this stuff because, there's so much we still have to dissect and contemplate and put together. For myself, I want to be as pragmatic and as professional as possible, essentially getting vortex into this space to help others based on what I've experienced that I can share, and also potential linking wisdom that can be utilized to help others who are either experiencing similar phenomena and or those who are actively volunteering for the NADP in empirical evidence gathering so that way we can actually put together some solid hard evidence and conclusions. What was really interesting is from the very beginning, my own behavior is very firm and confident, and also understanding different things and how we apply this is just for myself often second nature. I don't have to think about these things. I understand them because I'm working with them day in and day out. And my two primary disciplines, essentially with canines and equids, require specific demeanors that you have to carry essentially to problem solve a lot of pathologies and problems we get, and attempting to figure out within our own ethogram as humans, because my personal opinion is that Dogman essentially is here to help reinforce co-adaptive evolution. And it's creating these pressures that are basically reinforcing primal order at the very basic level. And how adept are you with responding to that? And how aware and knowledgeable are? Because after the incident in 2012 with whatever walked through the woods bipedal, and then was up on the top side of the adjacent to the barn that I pursued down through um, the woods, was my state of mind and demeanor is obviously running on a high level of vasopressin rather than stress. I know I'm already in a test, a dominant personality. I have the leadership gene of all other types of criteria that essentially make my own physique and physiology. But those are things that I obsess about as well. And we all essentially have baselines that can be upgraded, although we all know that selective pressures can enhance these things that have solidified my persona and who I know I am, especially in nature, and who I walk out and am being, who I embody. But with that particular situation, before I jump into these next three situations and tie in hopefully some helpful insights for others to gain from, is that one, I wasn't alone. Because when I first moved out to the setting that I'm in, which is very isolated in the wilderness, and I spent the majority of my time by myself, I really wasn't, I didn't feel I was prepared for that. Essentially, I was excited for that when all those things aligned, because this is what I've been waiting for my whole life. And, for any scientist, it's your lifelong legacy and work. What are you doing? But this environment and setting was perfect because it also helped me to heal, even though I'm still in the escrow and process of fine tweaking some other aspects that just are directly tied to artificial constructs that we have created essentially as humans, and our own wet red queen dynamic, essentially, that is like we're spinning out in the place trying to constantly evolve just to stay in the position you are, or to try to strive, to parallel ahead. Being in this environment initially was shell shocking, but I'm already fine tuned for this level of setting. So it's almost like that first plunge, like that initial shock of the extreme cold, or you've ever gone into the tanks like I have had that go down to negative 222 degrees. The shock of that like reverberates and revives you to this aspect that you felt was missing. And for myself, the setting of that circumstance, because I my personally, in sharing my own personal experiences, which normally I don't do unless there's some form of mutual benefit to gain, because I'm typically a very private and quiet person, except for the fact that obviously astrology is very important in understanding those cymatic coordinations with Gemini. So I have very strong traits to bring specific messages forth. And I utilize that wisely. And that also essentially shifted my own demeanor. And that level of expansion completely shakes up your whole perspective of everything. It just gives you a different level of perspective and how you navigate life. There is now no longer a fear, but that edge also gives you an enhanced level of cognition and awareness. And when you apply that in conjunction with ethology and understanding behavior mechanics in relationship to naturalism, you can become very coherent with nature. And in a wild setting, it's different than our domestic settings. Within a domestic setting, we tend to have a lot more manipulative influence, where we're controlling certain conditions and setting and context to basically shape behaviors the way we desire or to experiment and enhance intelligence. But in the wild, when you're dealing with another individual that has full free will, there's so much variability within that context, even though there are guideline principles. So for myself, while what happened in 2012 was very bizarre, peculiar, and also essentially high risk, which was another reason why that particular incident, my demeanor was a lot stronger. But that whole particular situation was just very unique within itself because not only was I alone, but I already knew with the level of intelligence, field experience, and formal education, how to apply all those wisdoms without having to think about them. And it's like this very delicate dance. How much pressure can you apply without essentially backing something into a corner where you could create serious conflict? The fact that I also had my canine with me and my partner was also adjacent up through the woods, all those factors combined essentially ties into anti-predation tactics. This is something nature naturally applies to itself, where if the predator is moving into a said territory, oftentimes the alphas or the elders of a group will zigzag towards a predator to gain valuable information and insight and see where they can apply pressure. And then it becomes this very delicate dance of who's pressuring and driving whom. And sometimes those tactics can essentially drive out and even keep a predator out. So it's different. That setting is very different than if it was just me by myself. And I also know, and I'm sharing this because we've had some situations come up here lately with individuals who are going out solo, which for myself, again, wanting to make sure that everybody out there who's doing volunteer work stays safe, is there's a difference in individuals who have been trained and understand a lot of these fundamental natures and or also actively embodying and practicing essential skills like self-defense in multiple forms, because there are so many different variables at play that for myself, even as a professional, I'm witnessing a lot of amateurs doing incredible high risk situations to try to obtain evidence that even myself would not do. I for sure would never go into a new or novel environment without at least one, if not two, canines, because I rely heavily on my dogs for additional sensing that is beyond my own capacities, since they have heightened sense of smell, naturally heightened senses of hearing, and are also cognitively in tuned with myself. So they're constantly reading myself and reading the environment, and we're providing feedback to each other in a mutually beneficial way. The same thing that I would also more than likely go out with at least one other individual, because you want to have somebody watching your back. So even though it seems like, and I've heard some people say, well, you're not going to get as much activity being in a small party or a small group. Well, obviously, that's because wanderers and stragglers in nature naturally are the ones who preyed upon and picked upon, or either you're going to be evaluated for based on your fitness and determined how that individual is going to engage with you. And that potentially can be very dangerous. For myself, that's something I can say personally is far too high risk. I know I would never do because there's so many extremes that could potentially happen, especially with an ambush predator that is opportunistic. And if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you're not the resident and owner of that particular territory, and or you're not prepared to make sure that you can claim your space and your sovereignty, you might get a harsh reality check. And we've had a number of those popping up, which is really unfortunate. And there's a pattern that is ensuing with that in these evolutionary strategies. And it makes a lot of sense. But at the same point in time, we need to stay safe. And we also need to stay cognitive. So that way we can not only collaborate with nature more harmoniously, but also in the gathering of evidence can be done safely without anybody potentially getting ripped apart. So in 2012, the pressure that I applied, I'm already skilled and adept and knowledgeable for that particular situation that occurred. And that particular situation falls into like a hawk and dove model theory. And also, essentially, over the course of the last 15 years, has evolved more into different types of strategies that are essentially evaluating one another. And this is natural in nature, especially among apex individuals when they have overlapping territory. And it's learning is essential in order to avoid conflict and to create more optimal levels of coherence. And my whole intention too, especially with the philosophies that I employ, was to also make sure that my intention was to create a spatial temporal niche partitioning within circumstances, which within all of our predators here, not just dogmen, but it's basically to create like systems, territorial systems operate very fluidly. And they often are very large domains that overlap and have resources that are shared ecologically. And as long as there's a balance to that without too much disturbance, then that typically creates an unspoken treaty between species where they learn what is potential danger, what can potentially create a cost of injury or even mortality, which you would want to avoid, and what also would create avoidance or aversion scheduling, where you just learn to adopt different patterns so everybody can be coherent. And domains in general, like your territories, your home ranges, and your personal space, your den space, um, your personal territory is going to differ than your general home range. My general home range is large and diverse enough that it includes a zoned ecological system within it where we function. Then we have our own agricultural function that operates very harmoniously, and then outside of that, we have our wilderness zones. So there's this beautiful flux within the habitats that should be that allow for natural habitation of natural wildlife, and also corridors where traversing can happen. Which is why I've said for myself personally, as long as there is not too much conflict occurring within our top side, we're the highest point of our property, where we primarily manage essentially more so artificially, was more so man-made managed, um, is creating a coherent dynamic with those other zones so that way we can live symbiotically and have minimal conflict. But obviously, if conflict were to arise, then we want to make sure that you're firm in your boundaries and you're firm in what you are claiming as the owner, as the resident of your space. If you're someone who has dealt with dogman phenomena or encounters within your own home domain, then these are essential skills and understandings. This is completely different than, say, if we were to go out up the road, because I'm surrounded by tens of thousands of acres of national forestry and parkland, or to the national parks and forestry. Um, you're now into a different game of rules because you're essentially now the intruder. So when those dynamics, those roles have to be very coherent within their natural principles. So even though what happened in 2012 can seem kind of crazy, that yes, I did chase off what had obviously been taking Gretchen's goats, that made me go, "What the heck are you?" And we had an experience that was akin to the hawk and dove models, which essentially are, in the game theory model of aggression, there's different models within that constitute how aggression plays out within nature. And the hawk and dove model is essentially like hawks essentially will fight over a resource until one is injured. It's not always true, but it's generally true. Doves, on the other hand, will typically display threat aggression or display rituals of agonistic behavior. But if a threat becomes too escalated, they often will choose to avoid and run from the situation to avoid injury. So that initial engagement was creating a firm boundary that I am claiming ownership and residency of this space. And obviously that's the first encounter of experience that we both had, that individual and myself, from who the prior owners had been here, who had done essentially nothing and cowered about those situations. So, that was very interesting, but again, it could have also played out a little bit differently had I essentially not had, end quote, backup, right? Because I had other family members, including my own animals, um, my own stock, that also we all support each other very coherently. There's a very coherent dynamic that I prefer to keep, and we're all attuned to each other, and we're all looking out after each other and essentially participating in altruistic measures, or that is the ultimate goal, even though there's been just some discrepancies within that. But I have a lot of empirical evidence, and knowledge is constantly evolving, and it's important to have an open mind anyhow in general, because that allows you to filter and understand information more clearly. So, with that particular context, it was unique within its own because it wasn't just me. Even though I know I'm equipped and have these skills essentially as a master guardian within my own stead, and have a beautiful equilibrium, but also this wonderful mutualistic hierarchy within the whole dynamic and system I'm managing, and everything about me was very strong in presentation. And that is very indicative in nature, even though we can potentially have extrasensory perception, although we still have to put a lot of scientific measure to that to validify what is speculative and what we are already postulating as general truth. Um, there are all these other affluent factors or sensory processing factors that tie into that. So I know who I was in that moment lined up with everything that was essential to present the very strong message that I did. And had the circumstances not worked out selectively in my favor, all I would have had to do was shout. And I know Ace would have came running. I just have so many different philosophies that we practice. So that embodiment and that experience in that context, my intention is to not give the illusion of this false embodiment, this false courage, this false confidence. What I want everybody to understand is that all of these practical skills and knowledge and awareness then are also subject to context, and then how that all plays out, which could be in favor of or not in favor of. So I just wanted to put that out there so that way everybody's, well, I could go run the Dogman off. Yes, essentially, you could put pressure if you're having a situation, because we just had that come up too a few days ago. If you're having a situation where you're being harassed or intimidated or even stalked, it obviously is an initiation. It's time for you to become aware of specific things and to shift where you need to in your own lifestyle practices and embodiment in order to close that gap and draw the boundary line where essential and crucial. But fast forward from 2012, which was December, that encounter. Then 2013, there was another experience that I couldn't quite calibrate. But again, I've had some very bizarre experiences my whole life. So if I don't understand something, I do my best not to jump to conclusions right away and just be open minded or put it in a bracket that seems to make sense at that particular time. But I was in the back room and I was laying with my back up against the wall, and the window was behind me, the big bay window. And it was dusk. Everything had already been done and settled for the night. And the same sound, the same footsteps that I had heard in the woods, again, were outside in my backyard through the leaves, like somebody was walking through the leaves. But it's bigger. It sounded like bigger, more spaced out footsteps than your normal human, which has a ta 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 often walk. It was tush, 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 tush. It was obviously a longer strided gait. It was very peculiar, and it was only for a few second time lapse that it seemed like it was coming closer to the back of the house. There were no lights on in the house, and I hadn't lit candles at that time. So everything was getting dark. In those moments where the striding was coming from an angulation of the woods towards the window through the backyard, and I happened to went to go glance over my shoulder. What I saw out of the corner of my eye looked like something that was as tall as my husband, that was gray, had gray fur, like was wolf-like, and had a mane like fur, and the eyes were so brilliantly yellow. And I only caught it for a glimpse out of my peripheral vision when I turned around. As I was trying to turn around fully, it jolted back in the direction that it went, and I couldn't see exactly what it was, but it caught me off guard that I was like, "What the heck?" Just looked over my shoulder into the window, and I was calming myself down, regulating myself as best as I could to process. I've just always been open-minded because of the experiences that I've had, it's basically prepositioned myself to not be as startled and be as scared and traumatized as I used to be when I was younger because I didn't have the right guidance. I didn't have the right elders around me who were giving me the level of awareness and knowledge and encouragement and understanding I needed to just label one size fits all within this never sat right with me. Then I always felt my quote unquote superiors were very ignorant. I've just always had more of an open mind, and I do my best to regulate my fear as best as possible. The older and mature you get, the more you have clarity and answers and the practical knowledge, which becomes wisdom, because wisdom is your applied knowledge, and your experience helps you then to create confidence and courage in how you navigate life. And I was very disgruntled about the situation, and I knew whatever it was, I couldn't just let it be. I stepped outside and I patrolled the area just to see if there was anything that was there. And there was nothing within the immediate proximity within 150 yards that I patrolled. I obviously didn't want to venture too far. And it's just a completely different level of experience. Again, it's not just like me. I have my entire family and a system that is also supporting and reinforcing the boundaries and regulations that I'm applying to where I'm saying and have been now that I'm realizing what we've been dealing with out here to essentially create um, a better coherency and not allow myself or anyone else to be intimidated or harassed or potentially be taken out because that's been very apparent. That was left on an empty note in 2013, and I didn't think too much about it, although at that particular time, lichens kept coming up, which was very interesting, periodically and sporadically. Um, but again, lichens, we're also dealing with Lyra, and we're dealing with that's then interplanetary. So I just didn't think too much of it. It wasn't other than the whatever occurred, I was very angered by that. What I saw was bizarre, and again, the experiences that I've had with UFOs and the different encounters primarily are actually, and this sounds very obscure, but for those who are already in alternative fields, will be more compassionate, empathetic, and understanding, are actually my future family, which is why there's that link. And that's why it's been apparent that they've been present prior to my incarnation and that it was vital and important for like my subjective experience to be pinpointed, essentially. And they've always been helpful though, other than the fact when I was younger, I was obviously terrified because if you put something into this bracket, but that's really not authentic and genuine. But again, um, the Dogman phenomena was just not even a thought. You know, you have to have a really open, expansive mind to just be able to embody the potentialities of these different theories. And also, not only that, but the level of importance of our ancient ancestors who took the initiative to carve things in stone to leave specific messages behind. We can't throw that history out. We have to embrace that. And how does that fit into the bigger piece of the puzzle? So I didn't think too much of it other than obviously it heightened my own awareness again because we're dealing with a few month time gap between the barn incident and then this incident. But I've developed coping mechanisms around that because, again, I'm essentially isolated a lot. Just the dynamic of being out here in those first few situations after we started leasing the ranch, because we originally did a contract to lease the ranch before we were able to do an agreement purchase and actually convince the owner to allow it to exchange hands. And It was quiet for a while. Fast forward to 2015, there was another incident and situation while I was cooking us some food. It was supper time, so probably about 5 or 6. Oftentimes, I don't keep clocks on in my house. I follow the sun. I'm up with the sun, I'm down with the sun, and my work schedule flows with a very coherent diurnal circadian rhythm, in order to make sure I stay optimized with what I have to tend to out here. So I'm not really sure the exact time, but it was towards dusk, but not yet dusk. The sun was still like right above the tree line horizon. And like right at the dusk time. And I had gotten the sense because I had been so used to my whole life being attuned to extrasensory perception and the adaptive mechanisms that I essentially had to embody and adopt in order to survive in the setting I was reared in, um, has caused my mind to be more in heightenedly aware. Many of us have embodied that. It's totally alienating our species away from how we're naturally supposed to be reared, and it just so you have these these um adaptive evolutionary mechanisms and strategies that are essentially like you're trying to problem solve. So part of that is enhanced extrasensory perception. Then you add UFOs and other types of phenomena in that, and I'm seeing my deceased grandparents and ancestors who visit me often, and different all types of different stuff that used to scare my mom and father when I tell them stuff. And nobody really knew how, because mediumship was still taboo, back in that era, and still largely is in certain spaces. I was aware that something was present. And when I followed that awareness, it led me right out to the window. And when I looked out the window, what's used to be all forest is um, partially been cleared for a half acre of our side yard, but that used to be all wooded. And there was something 2 trees back that was about as tall as my husband and had pointed ears like Batman. That was dark in silhouette because the woods around here are so thick that sometimes visibility is very difficult to see even 20 yards in. And it can also get dark and overshadowed. So I can't say specifically what color of what it was that I saw. It could have potentially been the same gray individual, but what appeared like black in silhouette, because obviously of the shadowing and contrast and the position of where that, and was actually looking and watching the porch. But as soon as I kept walking, I saw it when I had turned, repositioned myself, and looked out the specific window where I was being called. And then I walked towards the window just to start getting a clear look and vision of what I was seeing. And also, if there was something there, to make sure I adamantly knew I know and am watching you and I'm aware of you, whatever you are. Because sometimes it's a coyote, sometimes it's a big cat, sometimes apparently it's Dogman. And then how do you handle that appropriately, right? To make sure, again, that there's these appropriate layers that we have where, of course, wildlife is welcome, but there are specific zones and corridors for those cohabitations to occur or where they can traverse. Um, as long as we can keep conflict minimal and there's a clear understanding of what you can and cannot take, what you can and cannot do. So, although speculative in my mind, I would think it is more than likely the same one. I was watching the individual who was looking at the porch, and it saw me and glanced at me as I was walking closer and retreated partially back behind the tree, where instead of having both essentially shoulders out in view down to about torso view, was then just partial of a shoulder and partial of the face. So again, I did not know how to label this. I was unsure if I was dealing with an extraterrestrial, because usually when something is present that wants to engage with me and provide some form of mutualistic communication or some form of helpful insight or downloads, I'm very aware of that. But very rarely do I get blocked and buffered. Usually, blocked and buffering is some form of camouflaging for some form of specific reason. And which can also fall under, dove mechanisms where essentially something is trying to avoid conflict and risk to injury and is trying to be more stealthy and learning how to potentially obtain resources without giving away their location. And I felt incredibly threatened. Again, there's a difference between a stress response that is fear, chaos, and, all of this essentially down regulating mechanisms that we can embody that are actually subordinate within nature. For myself, and knowing that, but at the same point in time, also having the hardwiring and the upbringing and the knowledge and the expertise I have, I know I automatically also embody these other factors. And you present that with a family dynamic, especially everybody knows not to mess with mama bear's cubs. Everybody knows do not go and mess with the lion who has her cubs. Everybody understands these basic philosophies in nature because you're hardwired to have those guarding mechanisms, especially a maternal instinct. And those of us species who are also destined and meant to be biparental, where we can also have the paternal aspect that actually have higher connectivity within vasopressin and actually um, have higher demonstrations of guarding mechanisms and vasopressin compared to other types of species or males that can often have downregulated um, mechanisms in relation to that. So essentially your courage, it's like it's vasopressin essentially um is like genuine rage, but for a good reason. It's not the stressed out rage. There's a difference in these mechanisms. You are seeing in real time the differences between something that is unsure and very stressed, which is how it appears the majority of people are behaving in circumstances, and that can potentially get you in a heck of a lot of trouble. Because if you're behaving that way, smell is already a strong indicator along with visual cues. If your smell does not match your visual cues, you're automatically going to be pinpointed and targeted for more potentially problem solving type behavior, where the individual who is potentially either predating upon you, or in my opinion, I also think we're potentially dealing with competition exclusion principle, where we have two apex species that essentially cannot coexist within the same ecological space or environment, um, if there's too much competition for resources. This is why, again, I'm also a firm believer in how we need to recreate how we're cohabiting within nature in general, especially surrounding what is becoming structured. So we have to parallel along with this if we're going to make sure that we stay safe. So with that, in 2015, after I was at the window again, very stern, just experiencing this I obviously felt threatened and intimidated. It's obvious that this individual is attempting to gain some form of information or insight, and it basically I felt like I was being spied upon. And also on top of that, before I had stepped outside, because at that particular point in time, I was also going through my licensings for animal communication through the UK because I wanted to go to the highest level potential training that was offered, although I really didn't gain anything and I end up offering a lot to my tutors, and passed my test with flying colors. And was using some of that wisdom at that particular point in time to get a read on this individual because again I just put it in I bracketed it in the ET category where I was like, you are so bizarre and weird, and what are you doing and why are you here, and why are you being shady, essentially. Because usually when I have layers set around my life space, especially if something that's interdimensional wants to communicate with me, I have buffer zones established so that way only specific frequencies can come in and connect and communicate with me. Although I may be aware of others, but you have to do that as a medium essentially to make sure you structure your space. So when I employed some of these methods, immediately the other individual was aware I was doing this, and what I got was I got a pushback, and then the individual slunk behind the tree and then retreated back towards the tree line to disappear where I couldn't longer see. So at this point in time, I felt enraged and I was angry. The context as well. I stepped out onto the porch and then I stepped out into the yard and I patrolled the yard again and stepped out even further on the edge of the tree line where I was pacing and staring and making sure I was staying squared off, like how a lion paces, to make sure it is very well known that I am upset and uncomfortable with your presence and your display and your demeanor, and whoever you are unwelcome unless you want to demonstrate some form of beneficial reciprocity, which is also a theory and hypothesis within ethology that allows us to understand that nature sometimes can actually be very coherent and essentially is mirroring itself. How are you going to behave or how do you behave is going to basically gauge my feedback and my demeanor back to you. So I'm employing these methods, and I was out there for a good while before we came back in because the sun had already dropped below the horizon. So it's probably about 30 minutes is what it takes on average when it's at the treetop to when it's about the horizon. And that's typically when I'm wrapping stuff up outside. But at that point in time, I was concerned with that. Before then, when the sun was right on the ground, I decided to go out and do chores. I needed to make sure that the message was strong enough and clear that, and me knowing my smell is going to linger as well. Not only my body language and my demeanor, if somebody is shrunk back, that my demeanor is matching my smell. And I'm getting a very strong, crystal clear message across in a nonverbal way to draw the line. So that was very interesting. And I actually wanted to talk today about what had happened in 2017, um, because that was one of the most um, intimidating encounters and experiences that I had, which also perpetuated my own realization that telepathy just isn't enough. The next step is necessary, which is when I began to seek clarity and awareness on how to activate these dormant potentials that are innate within our own capacity, and not only potentially innate within our own capacity but also demonstrating within what are currently classified as cryptids. However, because we're already at an hour, I want to wrap up today so that way we can come back to what happened in 2017 the next time, and my own concepts and putting together and many mysteries that we're still contemplating. So I want to thank you for walking the edge with me and Midnight Lycanthropy and the NADP. If tonight's message helped you feel like you can keep the lantern lit until it's time to blow it out and stay safe out there at night, please be sure to like and subscribe. Drop a comment if any content resonates. And to everyone across North America and all over the globe listening in trucks, cabins, cars, or wherever you are, in a city, apartment, or homestead, thank you for tuning in and holding the frequency for Dogman clarity. Make sure to report any anomalies through the official NADP networks and to stay safe out there. Remember, observation changes the observed, and cognitive empathy with highly attuned awareness can stabilize what we influence within life space fields more often than most give credit to, and how we behave directly affects the reciprocity of life space field feedback. Be brave, be kind, and be clear. And until next time, good night and good evening. Stay safe and stay sane out there, Midnight Society.
The fear in your eyes, exquisite. What gifts have been brought to me? Once again, this vampiric relic is in the proper hands of LordeStarfox and, of course, the Midnight